We'll now turn to our panel of experts, and it's a great panel. It's very rare to have a panel this cool, in my view. I mean, we do a lot of these things, but this is going to be outstanding. We're going to look at the future of housing policy. Phyllis Caldwell is the former chief of the Homeownership Preservation Office at the Treasury Department. She is now an independent advisor and sole member of the Roxton Civic Ventures, providing advisory services on various financial, housing, and economic development matters. Richard Epstein is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of law at New York University Law School. Professor Epstein researches and writes on a broad range of topics, including real estate, development, and finance, but a lot more too. And finally, Gene Sperling. Gene and I go back a ways. The former director of the National Economic Council under both Presidents Obama and Clinton. He's also an economic advisor to guess who? President-elect Joe Biden. Gene, it's great to see you, all of you. Let me just start with Phyllis for a moment and go to you, and we'll load up. If you were, when we kind of in these moments of political inflection points, we're looking, and we're doing a program about how to get a policy issue right, a lot of platitudes get tossed around. And I'm interested in getting down to brass tacks. If Joe Biden were to put together a really smart program that moves the needle on housing affordability, what would be some of the key elements that you think need to be part of that package?
Well, thanks. And let me just say, going into this, I think we should all be optimistic that we can all agree that the COVID crisis has had a huge impact on affordability and that there's a supply crisis. And so I think going into it, we should really leverage those tools that we know are working. One is the continued assistance for renters so that they can stay in their homes. Continued assistance for homeowners so that they can continue to make their mortgage payments. So I think we all agree those have worked. I think we need to continue to expand the housing tax credit programs, both to increase the supply of rental housing and the home buyer tax credit for first-time home buyers. And then third, the supply issue. And I think we've heard some great suggestions on how housing relates to infrastructure and how housing is a workforce issue. And so the more things we can work together to increase the supply of housing, to manage affordability, to keep the programs we've had in place that support affordability and deal with the crisis response to COVID, I think we need to do all three of those things at once. And
I mean, before I jump to Gene, do you think they're doable? I mean, sometimes I can just feel the tension in the way you talk about them. I used to live down in Los Angeles. You go down to the beach at Santa Monica Beach, and if you have a big wave come, there's not a lot you can do about it. But I mean, sometimes you wonder whether the wave is so large now, will what you laid out be an adequate response in this time? Because I sort of feel like the tsunami is large.
The tsunami is large, and sometimes when you have a tsunami that large, you just want to pause and freeze. And we've seen that in other crises. And so while you may not be able to solve everything at once, inaction is not acceptable. And so I think we have to keep moving forward on those things. Ideally, it would be better to go bigger, but if going bigger is going to end up in a long, protracted fight, we just have to do something because the status quo is not acceptable.
Gene, can I ask you what you think is a smart policy? And I'm going to do a promo for a moment. You wrote a great book published this year on called Economic Dignity. I think everyone should read it. The key elements of I talked about it earlier with Steve Stivers. What is a healthy community put together? What are the key pieces of it? And I think you anchored it in this concept of economic dignity. So what is the policy connected to dignity that we need to not miss?
Well, first of all, whenever you're facing any deep problem, housing affordability, the racial homeownership gap that we face in our country right now, which President-elect Biden has made a top priority. Whenever you're facing anything, the one thing you don't want to do is go backwards before you have a chance to go forward. So right at this moment, we need to, first things first, we have to prevent people from being evicted from their homes and being foreclosed on. If there's one thing you learn, you talk about dignity, is that a lot of people get through a recession with some pain, but they come out okay. But there's a certain number who are evicted, foreclosed, face long-term unemployment, where the humanitarian and economic scars are not recovered. And it's a terrible humanitarian and economic loss. So number one, we need to extend this eviction moratorium. And I have to say, I do not think it is right that industry is trying to overturn that. We should be the opposite. The industry should be joining advocates in fighting to extend the eviction moratorium and then make sure there is real funding to that can go to landlords so that they're not hurt, keep people in their homes. I know where that's renters and we're about homeownership, but this is people, and a renter thrown out in the street is devastated and is not going to be in a position to own homes. And the same on forbearance and foreclosure. This needs to be extended. We need to keep everybody in their home that we can. I think that with the vaccine coming, it will make sense to extend forbearance longer, make sure people still have a few months after formal forbearance ends. And then if people's incomes have gone down, we need to start helping people on loan modifications and other things to keep people in their homes. So this is true for anything in life. Don't make the problem worse. Keep people in their homes, particularly people of color who face so many obstacles. And then, I believe when you talk about the movement towards closing the racial homeownership gap, which, as the congressman said before, is critical to closing the racial wealth gap, you've really got to hit on 4 or 5 areas. You got to stop first of all, the discrimination. We need to reverse the rollbacks that were done on disparate impact and affirmatively furthering fair housing. We have to look at a lot of the ways that the system ends up discriminating against people of color. It seems if you are a homeowner of color, your house gets appraised too low when you're trying to sell it, but too high when they're determining your property taxes. The same with how underwriting is done. And I think one thing that is really important is down payment assistance. And one thing I really hope that we could get support on across the aisle is something like what the vice president proposed, a $15,000 down payment assistance. Because if you have a racial wealth gap, people can't give their children, their loved ones, that little extra many of us get from our families to help them get that home. So if we had significant down payment assistance, something like $15,000 would allow someone to get a $300,000 FHA loan, perhaps without any down payment. This could be a huge step forward on increasing home ownership, but particularly Black and brown home ownership.
Gene, thank you for that. Richard, let me ask you what pieces of this you would put into the puzzle, what you agree with, what you don't agree with. And I guess broadly, if you think the goal is to get to a point out of the mess we're in right now, where you've made home ownership, home renting, dignity, an ongoing part of that economic story in America, what do we have to get right?
Well, I basically disagree with pretty much everything that's been said thus far. In my view, the difficulties that we have in this case come from an overregulated market. And what that does is it constricts the supply that can be done and raises the prices. And so the first thing I think that one always wants to do before you throw more subsidies, which are going to create distortions in other sections in other markets, is to figure out which of the particular regulations that you have which ought to get rid of. Let me give you one example. If you take something like the affordable housing programs, these things are rarely put on budget. What happens is what you tell homeowners or developers of rental housing that you have to hold aside a certain fraction of the things to be done at below market rates. If you calibrate that wrong, nothing gets built at all. And so what you really want to do is to increase the aggregate supply. You don't really much care where it goes in. So long as the totals are greater, then people will start to shift back and forth. One of the dangers that are associated with giving constant protections against eviction is that there's a normal life cycle in which people move from one place to another as much as 10% a year. You start giving eviction protections, people who ought to move will not move. When it comes to the question of home ownership, I think that that's a mistake. What you want to do is to find out the most efficient way in which the housing can be supplied. For many people, renting is far more efficient than is buying these kinds of things. And if you start throwing subsidies in favor of home ownership, but not in favor of rental, you could again further distort the particular way in which the market goes. As a general matter, I'll just end on this particular note. Every time you decide to impose a tax, it's coming from somebody else. and from some particular area. So the first thing you want to do is to figure out which kinds of regulations you could remove prudently and safely, and then worry about the kinds of subsidies. And I fear that what's happening is that the kinds of policies that are being advocated are the very kinds of policies, for example, which have turned housing in California into such an infernal mess. And if they had decided to deregulate much more earlier on the zoning front, it would have been far better than it is today. And I fear that the policies that are announced, if they go too far in this particular direction, will essentially make all America look like California when we'd rather it look like anything else.
Richard, I appreciate your provocation. I'm going to go over to Gene and Phyllis to respond in a minute, but let me offer you a little bit of response myself, which is, I still know homeowners who were buried by the 2008-2009 financial crisis, who lost their jobs, who had economic hardship. A lot of them are relatives of mine, still wanted to stay in their home even though the mortgage is underwater. Incredible, crushing hardship. And then as Gene and Phyllis just shared, when you look at the racial disparities, you look at other income disparities, and you also just look at the fact that however we've organized our economy, there is a large economic inequality. And so when you're kind of looking at this question, the market had a pretty good free hand in generating the results in 08-09. And what I think I'm hearing from you is we need that kind of world. So, tell me where I'm wrong.
Well, look, the entire crisis created because we gave artificial loans to people, tiny down payments, and the kinds of subsidies that you give created highly leveraged individuals. You had all of the materials that were associated with the Community Redevelopment Act, which created further distortions in these markets. It would be, I think you're just waiting for trouble to start to happen when you build things under these circumstances. And the only way in which you're going to get sound development is not to try to put people in with subsidies that leave them over their head and vulnerable to financial crisis, but to go back to the more traditional views on this particular subject, which say you want private banks to make the assessment. And I do not think home ownership is an ideal of itself. If it turns out rental housing run by sophisticated landlords is better, you want to do it. So the run-up in housing policy to 2008 was a disaster, and that what you then do is you reap the whirlwind. So I think it's just a mistake to start at that particular time. Also, one of the other things you should remember, if you decide to keep the current tenant in place, it's an enormous stress on the landlord. If the property is underwater, it turns out that the premises are likely to be deteriorated. The cost of foreclosure turn out in many cases to be really astronomical, and the unit can't be circulated to somebody else. So it's not the question of keeping tenants in their current places. It's trying to figure out how you maximize the total amount of occupation of this housing. And if that requires some degree of movement, when you basically simply entrench the current status quo, what you're doing is you're freezing all the inefficiencies that have been developed in the market to date and keeping them going forward. So I do not think that this is a wise policy.
Richard, thank you for your candor. Phyllis and Gene, let me come to you. Phyllis, I worry about people, and I guess what Richard I think is saying is less government solves the problem more. I'm just wondering how you see the picture.
So, well, first of all, let me just say, Richard, I do agree with some of the things on regulation, and one of the things that we've really seen is zoning in single-family neighborhoods for 2 acres, and the fight against that regulation when it wants to be changed to have affordable dwelling units if someone wants to rent their garage. So I do think to the extent, if it's a free market for all and density increases, that's a time when you see a lot of pushback from the same people that don't want to help homeowners stay in their homes.
So they want the regulations that keep folks out.
Or that keep property values high or other kinds of things. So we should just acknowledge that market distortions from regulation go across the board. But I think one of the other things that when you think about the market, one of the things we learned from the 2008-2009 crisis is that it's better for everyone if people stay in their homes, and if they can't stay in their homes, if they move logically to a more affordable situation. So no one is saying force people to stay, but I do think that ability to move to a new living situation without having your credit damaged, without having your dignity removed, is a way to happen. So no one's saying keep everything in the status quo, just saying give some support for those things that are already distorted in the market so people can move in a logical way and that there is shelter and housing, for people to have their dignity. To your point on renters versus homeowners, I think we all agree that housing is important and that there are some people for whom homeownership does not make sense. But we do have to recognize that one's home is the largest source of net worth and wealth that people have to pass to their offsprings and future generations. And if we want to bridge that wealth gap, homeownership is a key. So thank you.
Thank you. Let me give Gene an opportunity to share his thoughts, and we'll leave him there. But Gene?
Well, Professor Epstein and I we're having a civil discussion, but we're not likely to agree on much. And I certainly disagree 100% with any interpretation that what happened in the financial crisis was instigated as much by trying to help people be homeowners as opposed to a reckless breakdown in the basic credit underwriting.
Credit default swaps, right? It was the CDSs and anyway, I just started to get in the way of your answer, but I just had to emphasize.
So I'll just say, without going back there, but listen, right now, let's just be honest. I mean, the crisis we're facing at this moment is due to COVID. This wasn't because the people now aren't being threatened with losing their homes because we think there was some problem in that they couldn't afford. We're having a once in 102 year pandemic, and people can't make payments, and there's going to be a lot of people that are going to struggle to get their jobs back or get them back at the same level. As Phyllis says, as you've said, it is just from a dignity perspective, but also from, ensuring that people can go on and have prosperous economic lives. You do not want this to be a devastating moment. So you do everything you can, as Phyllis said, to keep them in their homes. Now, forbearance is an extremely elegant policy solution. It doesn't say the person doesn't owe the money. It's just relieves them of pain for a while until the economy gets back on their feet, till they get back on their feet. The payments are tacked on at the end. So if we make sure that people can get into forbearance, if we make sure that when forbearance ends, they can't be foreclosed right away, that they still have the 120 days they need. If we have time to say where somebody is only going to make 80 or 90% of their past income, hey, can we work out a loan modification? Those are all reasonable things that we can do as a society to keep people in their homes, which I think will be good for the industry. I think it will be good for those people's humanity and dignity. And I think it's the right thing for the economy as well. Now, I do think that where there is some agreement is I think many people would like to see at the local level more incentive to build affordable housing. I would love to see a kind of national homeownership strategy where we allowed different regions to have the funding to deal with the problems that are most specific to them. It's different in East Palo Alto than Detroit. So in some places, the money is needed for rehab and for renovation and to fight blight. In other places, it is to build more affordable units. We want to make sure that when people are foreclosed on, that you don't have all these landlords that might be from private equity, not connected to community. Let's at least first give a chance for the community and for the homeowners to still have that control. These are all things that you may not have a one-size-fits-all strategy, but we should give the funding and support so that each region can do what they can to make sense in building home ownership, building increased supply where that makes sense. And I think that would be, a very important and productive a strategy that could help a lot of different regions meet their particular affordability gaps.
Gene, thank you for that. Go ahead, real quick, Richard.
Yeah, look, the first response is a lot of the dislocations we see in the housing markets are because of very unwise policies with respect to labor markets. The massive lockdowns in places like New York City have created these difficulties. Many of them, I think, are not justified by the COVID concerns. And so it's not that you're going to solve the housing problem by going into the housing market. You have to rethink the way in which you want to regulate the labor market. The second thing, in terms of the dislocation from housing, rents have cratered everywhere throughout urban areas. In New York City, they're probably down 20, 30%. Dislocations in those markets are much less costly than they are otherwise. And it's not going to be that everybody's going to be on the street. And the moment you decide to have the policy of deferment, you run the following very serious risk is people will defer. And then what they will do is they will move and you will have to chase them down. It's going to be extremely difficult in order to do that kind of a strategy. And essentially not changing your legal rules in the way in which has been proposed is more likely to create some kind of more honest behavior. So these are very controversial policies, and I think that we ought to think long and hard before we continue them. You don't want to bankrupt landlords, which is what's going to happen if you don't allow tenants to pay.
Can I just make clear that I believe that the people who are supporting both increasing the rental moratorium and foreclosure are not trying to bankrupt landlords. In fact, on the rental side, I think the reason you have $50-60 billion in the HEROES Act is precisely so that landlords can be paid off and they're not hurt. Secondly, we're facing a COVID crisis. I mean, I think I'd probably disagree with you generally, but this is a once in 102-year pandemic, and to pass over the complete faultlessness of people who just happen to be alive and homeowners at
it's on both sides.
Just seems very wrong to me. Since I know we're going to end, Richard, I just want to make, Steve, one point, which I think is an important one, which is, even with divided government, we may end up having a chance at an infrastructure bill. And I think one of the important things Biden did in his Build Back Better plan, which I think other people should think of, is that when one has an infrastructure bill, a rebuilding America type of bill, affordable housing should be part of that. And I think it will have a greater chance if we think of that as being part of a major jobs infrastructure bill as opposed to a separate item. And I think that's something worth everybody who's thinking about the need to build more affordable housing to think about in the coming year.
I'm really glad you put that on the tape. Richard, I got to cut it off there because we got two questions I want to squeeze in, but I want to thank Gene for putting that on the table, because my next question, which now I won't ask, was going to be about infrastructure. And also to, Alicia and Chuck, when they were speaking earlier, we're talking about workforce development. We've also got, whether Richard agrees or not, we have a lot of people that are not in the workforce development side of this industry right now, which has got to be addressed. There's going to be a workforce shortage, and as we just heard from Steve Stivers, a real graying of those people in the homes trade. So let's squeeze in two questions if we can real quick. Marta Tataje, board member, National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Marta?
According to the 2020 State of Hispanic Homeownership Report, as published by NAREP, non-Hispanic white families held $2.80 in wealth to every Latino household's $1. What plans are underway to bridge the wealth and homeownership gap? Thank you so much for the consideration.
So short form, thank you for that, Marta. Cynthia, your thoughts? Or Phyllis, excuse me. I'm getting too many. Phyllis, excuse me.
So thank you. I was looking for Cynthia.
Yeah, the other Cynthia out there, exactly. So
as I mentioned earlier, we have to acknowledge that homeownership is still a primary source of wealth for families. And I think we have to think about two things in this: increasing the supply so that we can get more people that belong in homeownership in homes. But also, you didn't raise climate resiliency and environment. And one of the things that we have seen from the wildfires and other things is that people of color and low-income people are often have houses in low-opportunity neighborhoods that feel the impact of climate. And so I think as we build back and we think about getting people into homes, we also have to think about homes and neighborhoods of opportunity and climate resiliency.
Thank you for that.
It doesn't fully address it, but I think it's important.
Thank you for that, Phyllis. Yes, Gene.
So, your question was a great one. It's really on the wealth gap. And I think there's one thing we know by studies, but we also just know it intuitively, that, if your family has a little wealth and savings, it can help your children and grandchildren have a bit of savings. So, for example, you can have a lot of people, Black and brown Americans, who have a good credit score, who can make the payment, but they may not have that help to get that first down payment, or they're trapped in student debt. So what we know is that student debt is absolutely leading to less home ownership among young adults, and particularly hard on Black and brown American young adults. So dealing with student debt will help people. But I think this down payment assistance really is a strong idea that Joe Biden's put forward. $15,000 advanceable down payment. So, even if your family doesn't have that help to give you that maybe little extra when you get married or something, so you can get that down payment, if you can have that down payment assistance and you meet all the other criteria, then I think that will give more Hispanic, African-American families, people of color, a chance to get into the home ownership arena. And, again, I agree with Phyllis and others. This is still the greatest source of wealth and wealth building for many, many families in our country. And I don't think there's any question that the lack of wealth leads to being able to help your children and grandchildren maybe start that business or get that down payment for a first home. So how do we break that negative cycle? Well, a $15,000 down payment, advanceable down payment for your first time home, or if you've been a victim of the financial crisis before, I think would be a very strong policy move to do, and one I would hope might have bipartisan support.
I'm against
Thank you. Richard?
Yes, let me say this. I think the question is building wealth, not building home equity. And so the advice that I would give, and the answer to the question is, figure out what your optimal housing strategy is. And for many people, it's to rent. And then take the residuals and invest it in mutual funds, which you could get at very low cost, and build up your wealth outside of it. There's nothing which says that the appreciation in real estate is going to be greater than that in these other kinds of funds. In fact, the stock market done is a lot much better lately than has the real estate market. So I think what you have to have is a much more global program. And again, what you have to remember is every time you decide to give a subsidy, you're going to create another distortion. It may well be that the subsidy will have a very desirable effect for some people, but for other people, what it will do is tempt them to go into a thing, buy a house which is more expensive than they could afford. And then what happens is they lose the house, and with it, they start to lose the subsidy. Subsidies essentially are money that comes for free. You don't tend to watch over it as carefully as you do if you get the $15,000 from within your kind of family. So again, what the biggest mistake of the Biden administration will make is they think subsidy first and deregulation second. You think deregulation first and then worry about pointed subsidies. You're going to do a lot better in the market.
We're right at the end. I want to get another question. I would just say, Richard, I hope we have you back, because I would love to talk to you about the history of redlining, the history of, I've talked to a lot. I mean, when you talk about subsidies, I don't think you've looked at the question of, who has been subsidized along the way.
That turns out to be incorrect. If you actually look at the redlining,
I'm sure we'll have a very good discussion. But
And I have to disagree. When you help, study after study shows when you help people be homeowners, that they will do more to care for their house and take more ownership in every way. So I feel like every study on ownership.
That can't be right. The default rate is 2.
We're going to take the next question. We have Judd Murchie, who's research and strategy at Wells Fargo. Judd?
My question for this panel is, going into 2021 and beyond, what opportunities or strategies or policies do you see as a way to ensure that the industry as a whole, and particularly the construction sector, is able to produce enough housing to meet demand, so that we can kind of slow and halt and reduce some of the challenges our customers are facing when it comes to housing affordability?
So meeting demand. Let me go to Phyllis. Phyllis?
So, a couple things. One, I think, is getting back into job training so that we can meet the labor crisis. COVID was notwithstanding, we have to learn to think about things new. We've got labor that is retiring, and we need to have people who can not only build the homes, but it's a source of jobs and income for people. Second, we have to look at zoning and policy, local policies that can support the increasing supply. I think as Jean said earlier, there's not a one size fits all. And that is something where local governments can figure out what are the things in their communities that can help spur affordability. And then I think third, it's important to work with local nonprofits that are in the business of affordable housing, that know what the communities need. And then finally, I think thinking about housing is an anchor point, but it really is the other amenities around a community, whether it's schools, access to healthcare, access to transportation, so that when you do get a house, you also get a lifestyle change too. And so I think that's got to be the focus.
I mean,
Housing
and that
is
was very
important, but
much
it's
part
an
of the
anchor.
discussion with Sherrod Brown, these other moving pieces of that.
Yeah, but
Richard?
one other piece, the permit problem. Eddie Glazer did a study in California, and you find out the cost of land there is about the same as other places. Cost of construction is about the same. But if you need 50 permits in order to complete a house, that costs you years and years in delay and distorts the entire process. And so the multiple permitting delay game is essentially the thing that stops more housing than anything else that you could possibly imagine. And so if you compare what it takes to get a permit in Texas with what it takes to get into California, you can understand why all the migration is going in one direction rather than in the other. And that's something which federal policy does not touch. It's local policy. And so if you want to get the comparison, be like Texas, don't be like California. Joe Lonsdale basically is taking his entire venture capital firm to Texas because he can't do real estate development in the state of California. And so again, permits are a form of perverse regulation. Getting rid of it, expediting the process will do more good than any subsidies that you care to mention. Lowering price is a more effective way to handle these things than keeping prices high and then taxing somebody else in order to give a subsidy to somebody else.
Thank you for that. Gene Sperling, I'm going to give you the last word, sir.
Well, we won't get into the redlining issue here, et cetera, but I will just add that I think that when we as a country do face a moral and economic imperative to overcome the burdens of the legacy that still exists in systemic racial housing segregation. And that's something that we need to fight on many fronts. The reason why you want to have a disparate impact rule is to make sure there's a rational process that people do not unnecessarily make the problems worse. But as Phyllis says as well, it takes more than just a housing strategy. It takes a neighborhood strategy to make people homeowners, but also have those homes have value and to be able to raise their families with dignity. You also need the investment that comes from schools, from safety, from parks. And so I would love to see our country have a kind of robust home ownership and neighborhood development strategy. I would love it to be robust, but I think as Phyllis and I have both said, would like to see it have the flexibility so that a Detroit that has a lot of supply but needs to deal with rehab and renovation and blight has the funding they need, where maybe an East Palo Alto that needs to build more affordable housing and change perhaps zoning laws has their ability to do that. And I think that would be great for our country, great for overcoming our legacies of poverty and discrimination. And I think that it would be obviously good for industry as well. This would be a way of lifting everyone up. I'm a little worried that people will be resistant in divided government, but I truly think that would be something where people would see home ownership, they'd see local economic strategies, and as we've talked about, they would see jobs and apprenticeships happening right under their nose. It would be a wonderful thing for our country.
Well, I want to thank the three of you. This was an edgy, civil discussion of I think we got a real taste of the debate. Every policy issue I deal with has multiple sides. I'm really grateful to all of you for your candor and your civility on this. Big thank you to Richard Epstein, Senior Fellow at Hoover Institution, Professor of Law at NYU, Phyllis Caldwell, former Chief Homeownership Preservation Office, the U.S. Department of Treasury, and Gene Sperling, former Director of the National Economic Council and advisor to President-elect Joe Biden. Thank you all very much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Thank
That
you.
brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to the National Association of Home Builders for their support and to all of you attendees for joining us for this very important discussion. And as I said, it can be an exciting discussion as we just had. For those of you who missed any of the conversations, you can check them out this afternoon. We're going to have the video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Thanks again to NAHB. Be well.